Hello. This webinar, presented by Tim Angstadt, summarizes an article titled Unlearning Automatic Biases: The Malleability of Implicit Prejudice and Stereotypes. This summary is a component of coursework associated with Business Administration 556, Diversity Leadership at Penn State University. The research article titled Unlearning Automatic Biases: The Malleability of Implicit Prejudice and Stereotypes was authored by Laurie A. Rudman, Richard D. Ashmore, and Melvin L. Gary of Rutgers University. The article was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2001, with the full details of the article reference provided in a reference slide at the end of the webinar. To begin, I offer a quote from Martin Luther King, Jr. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. This article investigates automatic biases and the ability to reduce them. Previous research relevant to and cited within the research article being summarized here indicates that although racism and racial prejudice is now culturally unfashionable, racial prejudice continues to exist. This is despite the significant reduction in self-reported prejudice. Where does this hidden bias come from? Interestingly, children often report prejudiced attitudes as they are less aware of egalitarian norms in society and the typical filters that accompany them. Additionally, when techniques beyond self-reporting are used on adults, pervasive anti-Black biases are often found, at times even to the surprise of the adult being studied. So why does racism persist despite lower self-reported prejudice? The authors of the study being summarized offer several reasons. First, whites may repress anti-Black biases because they conflict with an egalitarian self-image. Second, people aware of their own prejudices may be unwilling to express them due to the increasing pressure of egalitarian cultural norms. In other words, being politically correct trumps expressing how they truly feel. And lastly, self-reported measures rely on respondents' introspection and do not capture automatic or implicit prejudices learned via socialization processes. These implicit prejudices are not directly taught, but rather learned via life experiences. To further investigate the potential to shape implicit prejudice, the authors set out to examine the effect of diversity education on student volunteers with several questions in mind. First, can diversity education in prejudice and intergroup conflict decrease overall racial bias? This includes examining both implicit or unconscious and explicit or conscious bias. Secondly, if diversity education is successful, are the reductions in implicit and explicit bias correlated in any way? Finally, are implicit biases permanent? The authors set up two experiments to investigate the potential to reduce racial bias. In the first experiment, they conducted a study involving 47 students. The experimental group of students, comprised of 30, enrolled in a prejudice and conflict seminar with an African American professor, while the control group of 17 students enrolled in a research methods course taught by a white female professor. Assessments of all students were completed both at the beginning and the end of a 14-week semester. Just as our class used implicit association tests, or IATs, to assess implicit stereotypes and anti-Black prejudice earlier in our semester, the authors of the study applied these tests to the experimental and control student groups as well. Additionally, a modern racism scale and self-reported stereotypes were used to assess explicit orientations within the student groups. In the second experiment, the author's approach was similar to that of experiment 1, but with two significant enhancements. First, two implicit methods were applied. The lexical decision task, or LDT, was used as a method of semantic priming to measure stereotypes, and associative categorization was used to measure attitudes, thus replacing the IATs used in Experiment 1. The second significant enhancement was to include a control group of students enrolled this time in a lecture course taught by the same African American professor as the Prejudice and Conflict seminar. These two experiments yielded interesting results. Overall, Prejudice and Conflict seminar students showed decreased anti-Black biases, while the control group did not. Not overly surprising given the subject matter of the Prejudice and Conflict seminar. However, the reduction in bias was observed in both self-reported or explicit and automatic or implicit methods, and covariance was also observed between the cognitive and affective indices. These results then, in turn, led to some interesting conclusions. Consistent with past research, insight into one's own biases combined with motives to be non-prejudiced were linked to reduced explicit prejudice. Additionally, affective processes appeared to reduce automatic or implicit biases. In other words, the content of the course likely drove explicit bias changes in a favorable way, while the act of taking the course, including interacting with diverse classmates and the professor, likely drove favorable implicit bias changes. The results also underscore the importance of using implicit techniques to detect biases otherwise not easily disclosed, including to oneself. The research results provide some key implications for practice. First, reduction in bias, both explicit and implicit, is best obtained by individuals seeking personal change. This kind of change doesn't happen accidentally. Next, diversity training should include implicit techniques to educate attendees about hidden bias in order to be truly effective. Also relevant implications for practice, the method of learning varies by bias type. While diversity training content is effective in reducing explicit bias, implicit bias is not reduced by such a direct educational approach. Instead, implicit biases may be unlearned much in the same way they were learned in the first place, and that is by using the various socialization processes and experiences with others. The questions on the next few slides will be posted in the Angel Forum for your consideration and response. Question 1. The authors note that self-reported prejudice has dropped significantly, while race-related prejudice remains. Earlier this semester, you completed an implicit association test, or IAT, related to race. Did your results agree or differ from your expected or self-reported results? Why? Question 2. The authors conclude the socialization process of interacting with non-stereotypical racial outgroup members helps individuals to unlearn hidden or implicit bias. Do you believe this to be true? Why or why not? Question 3. This study focused on voluntary recipients of diversity education and found a favorable reduction in bias among the experimental group. Do you believe the same result is likely in an involuntary, and by example workplace, diversity training scenario? Why or why not? Finally, I am providing the full reference information for the research articles summarized in this webinar. Thank you for watching.